The media call it the Alcatraz of the Rockies, but the FBI has a more accurate description: a place where every signal is cut off. Among more than 400 inmates, only the H unit is considered an absolute no-go zone. The only area in the United States built not just to contain people, but to contain information. The 10 individuals featured in this video are not ordinary inmates. They are seen as potential threats even when restrained, locked down, and monitored 24 hours a day. Why? Because even a single letter, a few spoken words, or a coded signal from them could trigger violence outside those walls. That is why the United States placed them under SAMS, Special Administrative Measures, a strict communication blackout designed to silence any external contact. So who are these people? And why is the government afraid of their voices? Number 10. Richard Reid, the shoe bomber. On December 22, 2001, a flight from Paris to Miami was cruising 10 kilometers above the Atlantic. One passenger bent down, fiddling with his shoes. A sharp smell of burning plastic began to spread through the cabin. Flight attendant Hermes Moutardier realized he was trying to ignite a detonator. The man was Richard Reid, a British citizen and former petty criminal from London. While in prison, he became radicalized, drawn into sermons that claimed the death of an enemy is the ticket to paradise. After his release, he traveled to Pakistan, where he learned how to make explosives. He later returned to Europe with one mission: to destroy a civilian aircraft and spread fear around the world. Inside his worn black shoes were about 280 grams of PETN, a powerful military-grade explosive. The detonator was hidden in the shoelaces, camouflaged with wax and nylon powder. Had the ignition worked, the explosion at 10 kilometers high would have torn the aircraft apart, throwing all 197 passengers into open air. But the fuse was damp, and the device failed. As smoke began to rise, passengers and crew members rushed in. Former basketball player Kwame James tackled Reid to the floor, restraining him with seatbelts and duct tape. The pilots made an emergency landing in Boston. 1 minute later, it could have been an international catastrophe. According to investigators, Reid admitted that he had received orders from an al-Qaeda cell in Pakistan. The investigation extended to Karachi and Cairo, uncovering a network that had trained several other attackers. Court documents indicated that Reid had been in contact with senior members of Osama bin Laden's organization. At the federal court in Boston, Reid calmly pleaded guilty. He declared, "I fight for Allah." Judge William Young responded, "That flag will still fly long after you and I are gone." The trial ended with a life sentence without parole, along with an order imposing special administrative measures, restrictions used for inmates considered capable of inciting violence or inspiring extremism. Reid was then transferred to ADX Florence in Colorado, the nation's highest security prison housed inside H Unit. Under SAMS, every form of communication is screened. Any deviation from approved content means immediate disconnection. He is allowed 1 hour of outdoor time each day in a small cage surrounded by steel mesh. In 2013, Reid filed an appeal, which was denied on grounds of national security risk. Since then, he has lived under maximum isolation with no contact allowed with other inmates. According to the government, this is not a form of retaliation but a precaution to prevent his influence from resurfacing. Even a figure like him, a survivor of an airliner terror plot, could still inspire others to follow his path. Today, Richard Reid sits alone in a soundproof cell, surrounded by thick concrete walls, where the hum of a vent is the only sound that travels. A man who once tried to turn the sky into fire now lives in a place where every signal dies before it can escape. To the United States government, Richard Reid is no longer just a criminal, he is classified information, kept under permanent containment. Number 9. Ahmed Omar Abu Ali. A laptop sat open on a table. Dozens of small files and a few notes read motorcade routes, security checkpoints, time windows. This was not the impulsive scribble of a lone extremist. It was a draft for a state-level assassination plot. When he was arrested in Saudi Arabia in 2003, investigators found scattered diagrams on Ahmed Omar Abu Ali's computer that detailed each movement in the motorcade of the President of the United States according to court records. Abu Ali had been a mathematics student in Virginia, born into a stable immigrant family. But after traveling to Medina to study, he heard sermons that praised glory after the destruction of the enemies of the faith. Over time, he shifted roles from a quiet student to someone who calculated probabilities for violence. Prosecutors said he communicated with members of al-Qaeda by email and received operational guidance. He did not act as a street fighter. He used logical reasoning to design attacks. Court filings state that Abu Ali discussed 2 plots, one to assassinate the US president and another to seize a civilian airliner and turn it into a weapon. One letter quoted at trial read, "No need to be large, just make them afraid." When the FA traced his communications, his network was exposed. Encrypted addresses appeared, along with contacts and logistics across the Middle East and covert channels for moving information. He did not hold the rifle down, but he drew the map for the person who would pull the trigger. At the trial in Alexandria in 2005, the full plot came to light. A jury convicted him on 9 counts, ranging from conspiracy to assassinate the president to plotting to destroy an aircraft. When he received a life sentence without parole, he simply said, "I have no regrets." In 2009, an appellate court upheld the conviction, noting in its opinion that the defendant's ideological threat endures. Abu Ali was transferred to ADX Florence in Colorado, the facility that houses inmates whose words alone could incite violence. Under special administrative measures, only approved contacts may place calls. Every line of correspondence is copied and archived. No word escapes outside the approved review process. Internal reports describe him as a member of a strategic ideological threat category, meaning he does not need weapons to do harm. His language can be sufficient. Now, Abu Ali lives isolated in a narrow cell. No internet, no group prayers, no unsupervised mail. Lights are controlled around the clock, with intensity changes used to simulate day and night cycles. A man who once calculated the numbers for an assassination now lives where every calculation is meaningless. Abu Ali is no longer simply a name. He is a signal placed in permanent quarantine. Authorities do not fear his voice alone. They fear the idea that might ignite in someone else. Number 8. Mahmud Abouhalima. New York in the early 1990s. Amid the grid of yellow cabs, one man stood out with flaming red hair and an Egyptian accent thickened by Brooklyn. His name was Mahmud Abouhalima. He knew Manhattan like the back of his hand. He knew every garage entrance and every tunnel beneath the World Trade Center. That familiarity made him a key link in a larger plot. On February 26, 1993, a truck loaded with urea nitrate sat in the parking garage under the North Tower. When the timer hit, the building shook. 6 people died and more than 1,000 were injured. The blast created a deep crater in the basement of the city's financial center. Abouhalima vanished and fled to Egypt within hours. He was more than a driver. He had worked with Omar Abdel-Rahman, attended radical sermons, and trained with Ramzi Yousef, Nidal Ayad, and Mohammed Salameh at shooting ranges in Calverton. They purchased industrial chemicals and assembled the bomb in a huge plastic drum. The stated target was the heart of American finance, meant as a message as much as an attack. When he was captured and extradited to the United States, Abouhalima maintained a defiant posture. He claimed they did not kill civilians. He said those people were in the wrong place. Prosecutors replied that an entire city was the wrong place. The trial in 1994 ended with a sentence of 240 years in prison. After incarceration, records show Abouhalima continued attempts to contact associates overseas through letters. In 2005, authorities discovered correspondence that promoted extremist ideology. The Department of Justice applied special administrative measures and transferred him to ADX Florence, where inmates considered a propaganda risk are held. Under special administrative measures at el-Hage, not all contact is completely cut, but communications are tightly controlled. Mail and non-privileged calls are monitored, copied, and screened. Phone numbers must be pre-approved. Any message that departs from the authorized script can be stopped. Contact with other inmates is strictly limited, and reviews determine whether restrictions are extended. Once a familiar driver on New York streets, Abouhalima can now only pace the length of his cell. No co-conspirators, minimal interaction, and the notebooks that once linked networks now sit in investigative files. At ADX, the remaining sounds are the ventilation fan and the clank of a lock. These measures are not punishment in the abstract. Officials say they exist because a correctly timed idea in the wrong place can cost an entire city its safety. Number 7. Ahmed Khalfan Ghailani. On August 7, 1998, 2 explosions struck almost at the same moment, one in Nairobi, Kenya, and another in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Windows shattered, cars burned, and the American flag hung scorched at the gates of the embassies. 224 people lost their lives, and more than 4,500 were injured. That day, the world first heard the name Al-Qaeda, and among those behind the coordinated attacks was Ahmed Khalfan Ghailani. Ghailani, a Tanzanian national, once worked as a mechanic. He was not the one who placed the bombs, but he handled the logistics, renting the trucks, buying the chemicals, and preparing the storage for the explosives. Within the group, he was known as the technical man, but that technical work created a catastrophe that shook 2 continents. The 2 blasts were less than 10 minutes apart, proving this was not a spontaneous act but a carefully synchronized operation. After the attacks, Ghailani disappeared from Africa. He escaped to Pakistan, changed his name, married, and opened a small internet cafe. 6 years later, in July 2004, U.S. and Pakistani special forces surrounded the house where he was hiding. The gunfire lasted 8 hours. When the smoke cleared, they found a computer loaded with hundreds of files, maps, contact lists, and training documents. American officials called the capture the final missing piece of al-Qaeda's first generation. Yet when they brought him to trial, they faced a difficult question: how to prosecute a suspect seized in a war zone under the rule of U.S. law. In 2009, Ghailani became the first detainee transferred from Guantanamo Bay to a civilian court in New York. The trial in 2010 lasted for months. Out of 285 charges, he was convicted on a single count: conspiracy to destroy government property. Still, Judge Lewis Kaplan made it clear, an act that took more than 200 lives, even one count is enough for a lifetime behind bars. On January 25, 2011, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Ghailani was then transferred to ADX Florence, the highest security prison in the United States. He was placed under special administrative measures, not to silence his voice, but to cut every signal around him. Even when the restrictions were partially lifted, the facility kept limits on group prayers. Officials said it was not a ban on faith, but a safeguard against coded communication among inmates. According to prison records, Ghailani prays alone in his cell while cameras record continuously. At ADX, privacy does not exist. Today, Ahmed Khalfan Ghailani lives in a white concrete cell in the middle of the desert, under artificial light that never fades. No comrades, no sermons, no audience. A man who once managed the logistics of an attack that killed over 200 people now lives disconnected from the world he once served. Number 6. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, April 15, 2013. Boston was glowing under the spring sun. Tens of thousands gathered at the marathon finish line, waving flags, cheering, taking photos. At 2:49 in the afternoon, the first explosion hit near Marathon Sports. 13 seconds later came the second. Glass shattered, and black smoke filled Boylston Street. 3 people lost their lives instantly, and more than 260 were injured, many losing limbs. In the chaos that followed, the Tsarnaev brothers vanished. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, 19 years old, was a student at the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth. Outwardly calm and friendly, into sports, and well-liked. But behind that facade was a young man influenced by his older brother, Tamerlan Tsarnaev. Together, they read online bomb-making guides, crafting pressure cooker devices filled with explosives, nails, and ball bearings, weapons built not for precision, but for attention. Their target was not military, it was the crowd itself, the place where fear would echo loudest. 3 days later, the FBI released the suspect's photos. On the night of April 18th, the brothers ambushed MYT police officer Sean Collier, killing him while attempting to steal his firearm. They hijacked a vehicle and threw pipe bombs during a police chase through Watertown. The shootout erupted in the middle of a residential area. Tamerlan was struck, run over in the struggle, and pronounced deceased at the scene. Dzhokhar fled, bleeding, hiding inside a boat covered with a tarp behind a house. When surrounded, he wrote words inside the boat, later called the boat note. He claimed the bombing was retaliation for American military actions in the Middle East and described the victims as collateral damage. Cold words that prosecutors described as a confession written in blood. In 2015, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was convicted on 30 counts, including 6 capital offenses. The jury returned a death sentence. In 2020, a federal appeals court overturned the death portion due to jury selection errors. But in 2022, the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty. The case remains open on certain procedural points, but the sentence stands. Tsarnaev is now held at ADX Florence, Colorado, inside H Unit, reserved for inmates whose words or presence could inspire violence. Under special administrative measures, all correspondence and non-legal phone calls are screened, copied, and archived. He is barred from contacting other prisoners and forbidden from any media communication. A prison official described it simply: he is not silenced, he is disconnected. Today, Dzhokhar lives inside a sealed concrete cell, under constant light, hearing only the sound of metal locks each morning. He is allowed 1 hour of outdoor time per day, still confined within a steel enclosure. No internet, no audience, no response. More than 10 years later, Boston still holds memorials for the victims. His name remains in public memory, not as a symbol, but as a warning that a single distorted idea can draw blood from an entire city. At ADX Florence, he has no crowd, no echo, only the cold light and the metallic rhythm of a door that opens and closes. The same pattern that will follow him for the rest of his life. A man who once tried to create fear so he would never be forgotten. Number 5. Umar Farouk Abdulmutallab, the underwear bomber. December 25, 2009. On Northwest Airlines flight number 253 from Amsterdam to Detroit, 289 passengers prepared to land. The cabin was filled with the warmth of Christmas. Music played. People smiled and talked. In seat 19A, a young man leaned down and pulled a syringe from his pocket. A sharp pop echoed, then a sudden burst of fire lit up the cabin. The smell of burning plastic spread, followed by screams. That man was Umar Farouk Abdulmutallab, 23 years old, a citizen of Nigeria. Hidden within the fabric of his underwear was over 80 grams of PETN, a powerful explosive almost impossible to detect with metal scanners. The detonator was a small chemical device triggered through a syringe designed by Ibrahim al-Masri, the chief bomb maker for al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. The detonator malfunctioned. Instead of an explosion, it created only a flash of flame. Passenger Jasper Sharinga rushed forward and restrained Abdulmutallab, extinguishing the fire with his bare hands. The pilots made an emergency landing in Detroit. Investigators later confirmed that if the explosive had worked properly, the aircraft would have disintegrated over Michigan only minutes before landing. According to court records, Abdulmutallab had been a quiet, intelligent student in London. But during his time in Yemen, he met Anwar al-Awlaki, the spiritual leader of al-Qaeda's Arabian Peninsula branch. Awlaki inspired him with the idea of striking at the heart of America and arranged for a bomb to be built specifically for him. The tragedy deepened when it was revealed that Abdulmutallab's father, a respected businessman and former bank official, had personally warned the U.S. Embassy in Abuja that his son was showing signs of radicalization. The warning was forwarded, but it never reached the no-fly security system in time. Flight number 253 took off as planned. In January 2010, Abdulmutallab was charged with 8 counts, including conspiracy to commit murder and conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction. In October 2011, he pleaded guilty and told the court he was proud to fight for his faith. On February 16, 2012, a federal judge in Detroit sentenced him to life without parole. Following the incident, the United States quickly implemented full-body scanners at airports to detect non-metallic explosives like PTN. Immediately after sentencing, Abdulmutallab was transferred to ADX Florence, the nation's most secure prison, reserved for inmates considered dangerous on an ideological level. He was placed under special administrative measures, every letter screened, every call recorded, and every contact strictly pre-approved. His world is 4 paces long. Cold walls, constant airflow, no internet, no group prayers, no human contact. In 2017, he filed a lawsuit complaining of harsh confinement, but the Department of Justice upheld the restrictions. Now more than a decade after that Christmas Day flight, Umar Farouk Abdulmutallab still sits in his bright, silent cell at ADX Florence, a man who once tried to bring down a plane over America, now buried inside absolute quiet, where no signal ever escapes. Number 4. Wadih el-Hage, August 7, 1998. 2 explosions tore through Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Glass shattered. Black smoke filled the sky. 224 people lost their lives, and more than 4,500 were injured. That day, al-Qaeda revealed itself to the world, and the man behind many of the phone calls, notebooks, and contact lists was Wadih el-Hage. Born in Lebanon, raised in Kuwait, and later emigrating to the United States, el-Hage once served in the U.S. Army and married an American woman. For a time, his life seemed settled, but in the early 1990s, he left the U.S. to work for Osama bin Laden, not as a fighter, but as an organizer handling logistics, finances, and communication channels for the group. From Sudan, he was sent to Nairobi, where he opened an office under the guise of a charity organization. In reality, it was al-Qaeda's East Africa communications hub. He coordinated engineers, accountants, and drivers, maintaining routes between the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. According to the FBI, el-Hage was known as bin Laden's notebook keeper, the man who held the contact lists and the operational details of the entire network. In 1997, when U.S. intelligence began to close in, el-Hage was questioned in Nairobi but released. 1 year later, 2 truck bombs exploded almost simultaneously. The plan he once helped structure had taken hundreds of lives. Weeks later, the FBI raided his home in Texas, where his family had returned. In his study, agents discovered thousands of pages of notes, phone numbers, and addresses tied to al-Qaeda operatives. In September 1998, el-Hage was arrested and became one of the main defendants in the case United States versus bin Laden at the federal court in New York. The trial lasted nearly 6 months. Prosecutors presented letters, phone data, and recordings of bin Laden's voice referring to Abu Abdallah. In May 2001, the jury found el-Hage guilty of conspiring to kill American citizens and destroy federal property. In October that year, he was sentenced to life in prison. In 2008, an appellate court ordered a review of his sentence, but in 2013 the life term was reaffirmed, along with over $33 million in restitution to victims. After that, el-Hage disappeared from public view. He was transferred to ADX Florence, Colorado, classified among inmates deemed communication threats. There, he was placed in H Unit, the section for international terrorism convicts, under special administrative measures. Every letter is read and copied. Every call is pre-approved. Any deviation from authorized topics results in immediate disconnection. A former prison employee once said, "Here, no one is allowed to send a signal, not a word, not a sign." 25 years after the embassy bombings, Wadih el-Hage still sits in his desert cell in Colorado. No office, no contact list, no orders to give. The man who once kept bin Laden's notebook now writes lines stamped, monitored, and approved. His entire life is a file, one that will never be closed. Number 3. Zacarias Moussaoui, August 2001. At a small flight school in Minnesota, instructors grew uneasy about a French student of Moroccan descent. He wanted to learn how to control a Boeing 747, but showed no interest in takeoffs or landings. The instructors notified the FBI. When he was arrested for an immigration violation, he insisted he was merely an aviation student. Yet investigators sensed something was wrong. His name was Zacarias Moussaoui. When agents examined his computer, they discovered records of communication with Mohammed Atta, who would later pilot one of the aircraft on September 11th. At that time, a search warrant under the FISA Act had not yet been approved. Weeks later, the United States was engulfed in smoke and fire. And Moussaoui, already in custody, became the living symbol of what officials called the greatest missed warning in American security history. Before that, he had traveled to Afghanistan, met Osama bin Laden, and trained at the Farouk camp. In 2000, he entered the U.S., opened bank accounts, and wired money from Europe and Malaysia to pay for flight lessons. When questioned, he remained silent, denying any link to terrorism, but the data spoke for him. Flight maps, money transfers, and contact lists found on his hard drive. After the attacks of September 11th, the U.S. government charged Moussaoui in federal court in Virginia with 6 counts of conspiracy related to terrorism, including conspiracy to hijack aircraft and to kill American citizens. The trial lasted 4 years, involving hundreds of witnesses and thousands of pages of evidence. In April 2005, Moussaoui pleaded guilty to all charges. He admitted knowing about the plot in advance, but said he stayed silent to protect his brothers. A year later, when prosecutors sought the death penalty, the jury could not reach unanimous agreement. A single vote spared him from lethal injection. On May 4, 2006, the court sentenced him to 6 consecutive life terms without parole. After sentencing, Moussaoui was transferred to ADX Florence, where silence is part of the security system itself. He was placed under special administrative measures, every letter read and copied, every call monitored, even communications with his lawyers recorded. He is held in a sealed concrete cell under artificial light that blurs the line between day and night. In 2015, he filed a statement claiming to have evidence of Saudi involvement in the September 11th attacks, but officials found the claims to be baseless. In 2021, the appellate court upheld his SAMS order, stating he remained a potential propagandist for extremist ideology. Today, Zacarias Moussaoui remains in H Unit at ADX Florence, where inmates no longer hear human voices, and the passage of time has no meaning. He was spared execution, but what remains is a different kind of sentence, a life of absolute silence for the man who once stood at the edge of the September 11th tragedy and did nothing to stop it. Number 2. Abu Hamza al-Masri. In the mid-1990s, in North London, the Finsbury Park Mosque became an unusual gathering place. Beneath the loudspeakers and the crowd in white headscarves, A man with 2 metal hooks instead of hands stood at the pulpit. His voice was like a command. That man was Abu Hamza al-Masri, Egyptian-born, naturalized in Britain, and self-described as the awakener of the Islamic conscience. He preached about holy war and the duty to strike at the enemies of the faith. Under his sermons appeared faces that would later make global headlines: Richard Reid, the shoe bomber, and Zacarias Moussaoui, the student caught before September 11th. Finsbury Park was no longer a mosque. It had become a transit station for an extremist ideology. In December 1998, a group of militants kidnapped 16 Western tourists in Yemen. When security forces intervened, 4 hostages lost their lives. Investigators later found that Abu Hamza had supplied the satellite phone and directed the operation from London. 2 years later, he sent followers to Oregon in the United States to establish what he called a religious training camp. In reality, a paramilitary site preparing fighters for combat. When al-Qaeda struck in Afghanistan, he publicly called it the Justice of God. By 2004, British authorities moved in. Police raided Finsbury Park Mosque. The mosque was shut down and Hamza was arrested. He fought extradition for 8 years, calling it a living death sentence. But the European Court of Human Rights ruled that detention at ADX Florence did not violate human rights. In October 2012, Abu Hamza was flown to New York. At the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York, he faced 11 charges: organizing the Yemen kidnappings, supporting the Oregon training camp, and sending recruits to Afghanistan to fight for al-Qaeda. In May 2014, the jury found him guilty on all counts. In 2015, the court sentenced him to life imprisonment without parole. He was then transferred to ADX Florence, the most secure prison in America. With both hands amputated, he cannot unfasten his restraints, yet officials say his voice remains more dangerous than any weapon. He is held under special administrative measures, every letter copied, every call screened, and phone access limited to a few minutes per week under supervision. In 2021, he filed a lawsuit claiming the conditions were inhumane. No group prayers, no physical contact, constant light 24 hours a day. But the Department of Justice argued the restrictions were not punishment, but prevention, ensuring that the voice once capable of stirring hundreds would never echo beyond those walls again. Today, Abu Hamza remains inside H Unit, surrounded by walls that swallow sound. A man who once called for attacks on America now lives buried in the heart of its most secure prison. A preacher who once commanded crowds now speaks only to the walls. At ADX Florence, the voice that once shook the world has become an echo that no one answers. Number 1. Ramzi Yousef. February 26, 1993. New York City. A single explosion shook the ground beneath the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Smoke poured from the underground levels. Elevators jammed. Thousands of people crawled through dark stairwells, choking on fumes. When firefighters arrived, they found a crater nearly 100 feet deep, as if someone had tried to tear Manhattan in half. The man behind the blast had already left the United States just hours earlier. His name was Ramzi Yousef. Born in 1968, trained in electrical engineering, Yousef was fluent in both chemistry and electronics, and he turned that knowledge into a weapon. The 1993 bombing was not designed for maximum casualties on its first attempt. It was a test, a proof of concept meant to show that if placed correctly, even the symbols of America could fall. After the explosion, Yousef fled to Pakistan, then to the Philippines. In Manila, he rented an apartment and began working on a far larger operation, codenamed Bojinka. The plan involved planting timed bombs on more than a dozen transcontinental flights and assassinating the Pope during his scheduled visit. To test his design, Yousef planted a small device on Philippine Airlines flight number 434. The bomb exploded mid-air, killing one passenger and tearing a hole in the fuselage. The pilots managed to land safely. It was a live trial for what could have become a disaster on a global scale. A small fire in his Manila apartment exposed everything: the wiring, the chemicals, the seat maps, and documents labeled Project Bojinka. 6 weeks later, Yousef was captured in Islamabad after a tip-off. The informant received a $2 million reward under the U.S. Rewards for Justice program. In federal court in New York, Yousef was tried for 2 major plots: the Bojinka Plan and the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. He was convicted on both and sentenced to 2 life terms plus 240 years in prison. The judge concluded that his actions represented a deliberate effort to cause massive destruction. Today, Ramzi Yousef is held at ADX Florence inside H Unit, the section reserved for inmates considered high risk for ideological influence. Under special administrative measures, every letter and phone call outside of legal privilege is screened and copied. All phone numbers must be pre-approved, and any form of contact with others is tightly restricted. His world is a concrete square sealed by 2 layers of steel doors. The light changes with the hours, but it never goes dark. Why such strict measures? Because Yousef was more than a bomb maker. He was an architect of a method, an engineer who understood how to turn an idea into a chain of explosions.